Our next speaker will be Lawrence Brown. Lawrence Brown is a graduate of the Boston Psychoanalytic Institute in both child and adult psychoanalysis, and a supervising analyst and co-chair of the Child Analysis Program at BPSI. He is on the editorial board of the Psychoanalytic Quarterly and is president of the Boston Group for Psychoanalytic Studies. He's the author of many articles and several books. Transformational Process in Clinical Psychoanalysis, Dreaming, Emotions, and the Present Moment is just one of them. He's currently editing a book of essays on Freud's Moses and monotheism. He has written extensively on various topics, including the Oedipus complex, trauma, counter-transference dreams, the analytic setting, aspects of Beyond's work, autistic spectrum disorders in children, and psychoanalytic field theory. I'll hold on to my Italian for now. Are you there, Larry?
Here I am.
Welcome.
Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Yeah, all right. So I'm on now, huh?
Yes, you are. Please proceed.
Good. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me here. It's great to do some work with CMPS again after 6 or 7 years, I think I was here. And it's also great to be partnering with my friend Giuseppe. We've done several programs together over the years. The last one was in Florence, as I believe, where each of us gave a paper, some aspects of psychoanalysis and art. Anyway, I'll start now. Deep into my training analysis, as I struggled with long-standing conflicts around ambition that had not yet yielded to numerous attempts to understand the dynamics from a variety of angles, my analyst told me the following joke. 2 cavemen were talking, and one asked the other, "Have you seen Oop lately?" "No," he answered. "You mean Oop, the one who discovered fire?" Yeah, that's the one," said the first caveman. "Well, isn't he the one who invented the wheel?" Said the other caveman. "That's the Oop I'm talking about." "Right, but what's he done lately?" I was surprised that he shared a joke, something he had never done before, which had a deep resonance in me that seemed to tap into the essence of what I was struggling with, though I could not say why. However, over the years, I have repeatedly returned to that joke, and each time appreciated its value in having addressed the various layers of conflict that were unpacked in subsequent treatment and self-analysis. In retrospect, the joke was one of the most memorable interventions my analyst made in terms of its direct and lasting impact, and it served the same function as similar to an interpretation, but actually more comprehensive in its reach. In preparing to write this paper, I contacted my analyst and asked if he recalled telling me the joke and whether it had spontaneously arisen in his mind. He replied that it had crossed his mind before, but in that particular session, it arose spontaneously, and so he said it as it came to him. In this paper, I explore three pathways to representing the analyst's unconscious experience of the analytic hour: reverie, countertransference dreams, and joke work. There are other concepts that I would fold into that, including the notion of characters in the field that Giuseppe and Ferro have written extensively about. And I will discuss the similarities and differences between these modes of representation. I emphasize that each of these phenomena occurs spontaneously in the analyst's mind, either in the immediacy of the clinical hour, reveries and jokes, or occurring serendipitously while asleep, dreams. Thus, I see each of these as related occurrences, which I term spontaneous unconscious constructions that are formed by a similar process. Briefly put, each are created by a preconscious thought that initiates an unconscious process from which the dream, joke, or reverie emerges unbidden in the analyst's mind. The end product of the being the joke, dream, or reverie of this development is an unconscious depiction as the clinician experiences it of what is occurring in the analytic field of the moment. In addition to rendering an unconscious snapshot of the momentary analytic engagement, I also see these modes of representation as potential markers and important elements of working through. I will begin by discussing the formation of a joke, dream, or reverie in the mind of the individual, and then later turn to formation of these spontaneous unconscious constructions in the analytic field of two minds. Clinical material from the analysis of an adult man will be offered to illustrate these three forms of representing the analyst's unconscious experience in the analytic session. So I begin with dreams, jokes, and reveries, and how they form in an individual's mind. In the interpretation of dreams, Freud detailed the process of dream formation. He observed that a preconscious thought that evoked an emotion during the day linked during sleep with a forbidden unconscious wish, and that this formation was subjected to the process of dream work to disguise the unconscious wish so that it might pass through the censor that kept it from appearing in consciousness. Dream work, therefore, engaged in a process, an operation of representation by which one thing, the unconscious wish, mated with the preconscious thought, was represented by another, the dream symbol. The dream work accomplished its camouflaging mission through the mechanisms of condensation, displacement, faulty reasoning, turning into the opposite, and absurdity. In Jokes in the Relation to the Unconscious in 1905, Freud introduced the notion of joke work, which is a mental process closely allied with dream work, and that, quote, nonsense in jokes is made to serve the same aims of representation as in dreams. Freud pays most attention to jokes that appear involuntarily in the joke teller's mind. This process is launched by a barely recognized preconscious thought that plunges into the unconscious, where it is linked with words and then effortlessly emerges as a joke, as Freud says, as a rule, ready clothed in words, close quote. In my view, the true joke is a temporary structure that appears unbidden in the joke teller's mind, like a dream or a reverie, and is one pathway to representing unconscious or unrepresented psychic material. Like a reverie and a countertransference dream, joke work creates a selected fact that unconsciously and instantaneously organizes the affects permeating the inner subjective field, which through the process of evoking laughter binds the meaning conveyed in the joke as a kind of interpretation. Each of these three unconscious spontaneous constructions demonstrates the mind's way of representing the range of unconscious emotions active in the analytic hour by compacting these into a highly condensed, multiple layered, and detailed construction. I use the word construction deliberately to suggest an active process of transforming the analyst's unconscious emotional experience into a more or less finished product, that is, a dream about one's patient, a reverie, or a joke. In Freud's usage, a construction was a consciously formulated idea in the analyst's mind about what could have happened in Alexander's early life to explain his symptoms. However, I am emphasizing an unconscious process that forms instantaneously to depict the multiple levels of emotional meaning activated in the here and now clinical situation. I cannot overemphasize the centrality of condensation in the formation of the spontaneous unconscious constructions I'm describing. Freud, of course, approached the dream's formation from an exclusively intrapsychic perspective, and through the act of condensation, the preconscious thoughts alloyed with unconscious wishes were mixed, matched, and assembled together, as it were, to create the dream's narrative through the dream work. Interestingly, he adds a fascinating twist to this process of combining different conscious wishes and notes that the act of condensation is preceded by a destructive process. Quote, when the whole mass of these dream thoughts, unconscious wishes, is brought under the pressure of dream work and its elements are turned about, broken into fragments, and jammed together, almost like pack ice, close quote, which gives you a sense of how different fragments of potential dreams are enmeshed together in a way that is not neat and smooth. Like instead, it's like pack ice, where the ice is just um, is the ice flow just crashes into other ice flow, and it creates something that's very different. Anyway, this evocative metaphor captures the image of fragments together and conveys an important aspect of the dream's construction, that the dream is not built from whole unconscious wishes, which are pieced together like a jigsaw puzzle, then disguised and assembled into a narrative, but rather each unconscious wish is violently dismantled as though sledgehammered into shards, and these assembled into the dream content. Thus, Freud asserts, in the formation of a dream, quote, a work of condensation on a large scale has worked out. Therefore, the fragments from which the dream is built derive from many sources. For example, one may have a dream of a threatening man, which analysis shows is a composite of the sneer of a high school teacher, the hair color, the hair color of a favorite uncle, the tie one's father wore in a funeral, the perceived impatience of one's analyst, etc. Thus, the relationship between the latent and manifest content is not easily detected, which accounts for the frequent impression that a dream may never be fully understood because of the seemingly endless array of unconscious wish shards, each with its own associative network from which the dream is built. Where Freud sees the role of dream work to disguise the unconscious wish, Bion asserts that the origin of a dream, while awake or asleep, is an affective experience that has not yet been represented, that is, not having been transformed into what he calls an emotional thought, that is, transformation from beta to alpha elements, upon which the capacity to dream. In my opinion, it is the emotional event that is yet to be represented which both calls forth the associated unconscious wishes and binds these together into the dream's narrative. If the individual unconscious wishes are the bricks from which the dream is built, then the mortar holding these together is the affective experience that resides at the center of the dream. However, we may wonder if it is sufficient to explain the formation of a dream solely by an emotional event that pulls the shattered unconscious wishes to its core, thereby creating the dream's highly condensed narrative. Or perhaps, is there a psychic agency at work which conscientiously chooses those elements, that is, alpha elements, that best signify the emotional experience in like a painter who carefully chooses the best color to capture a particular mood? James Grotstein suggests the existence of an internal presence when he asks, who is the dreamer who dreams the dream? He proposes that we replace dream work with the notion of a dreaming couple, a successor to the earliest exchanges between the infant and the mother, whose containing reveries give meaning to the baby's emotional experiences. Italian colleagues, one of whom is with us this morning, have viewed this activity as a sort of stagecraft, one of Giuseppe's ideas, with an internal cat who picks the best inner object or creates it anew, that is, a character, to represent the emotions which suffuse the field. So now I want to turn to jokes, dreams, and reveries, but how they form in the group mind, i.e., within the analytic field. Freud's theory describes how a dream forms within an individual psyche now on the mutual unconscious process of shared dreaming that defines the intersubjective analytic field. The concept of the psychoanalytic field usually is credited to the work of the Uruguayan analyst, the Baranges, Willie and Madeline, who proposed the notion of a shared unconscious fantasy of the couple, quote, that structures the bipersonal field of the analytic situation. In their view, the dynamics of the analytic couple are very much like a small group of two people, that there arose from their analytic engagement a shared unconscious fantasy, and that, quote, neither member of the couple can be understood without the other. Now, Giuseppe, in his talk earlier, with which I agree, and I say here, although the Baranges did not reference Bion's work on groups in their initial writings in the 1960s, it strikes me that the idea of an analytic pair as a small group relates very closely to Bion's concept of the basic assumption in group work, which he developed a decade earlier, a decade prior to the Baranges ideas. Indeed, to Bion's work on groups and the existence of an unconscious fantasy in the group, stated that, quote, this is what we mean by the basic unconscious fantasy in the field of the analytic situation. Bion's proposal of basic assumptions grew out of his work on therapeutic groups that began in the mid-1940s. He observed that the treatment groups function on two levels simultaneously. The work group, in which members engaged in various conscious tasks, which coexisted with unconscious basic assumptions that ran parallel to the work group. He posited three kinds of basic assumptions that are fantasies unconsciously crafted from the individual psyches of the group members, a process that is, quote, instantaneous, inevitable, and instinctive, and involves a capacity for instantaneous of one individual with another, close quote. This idea of instantaneous combination foreshadowed Bion's later concept of the shared O of the session, an ambient emotional core created from the unconscious engagement between the interacting psyches of analyst and analysand, which was subsequently represented or dreamed by each partner through the appearance of unbidden, wild thoughts, what I'm calling here spontaneous unconscious constructions. Bion emphasized the futility of attempting to discover the origin of these wild thoughts, quote, for which there is no possibility of being able to trace immediately any kind of ownership or even any sort of being aware of the genealogy of that particular thought. Ogden says it much more plainly when he suggests it's not important to ask whose thought was it. In other words, as Giuseppe was talking earlier, it's the thought of the field. From an inner subjective perspective, a question may be raised. By what process and through which psychic agency is the shared unconscious fantasy of the hour organized? In the immediacy of the analytic hour, affects arise in the internal worlds of the patient and analyst as they unconsciously communicate, and a shared unconscious fantasy of the basic assumption evolves to narrate or dream the emotional situation of which the analytic couple bear. This shared fantasy is constructed from experiences in the psyches of the analyst and the patient that resonate with the emotional core of conscious experience and represents their respective transformation or dream of the field's emotional you from within each of their unique representational worlds. Thus, particular internal objects in the analyst and the patient's psyches are identified as best suited to represent the emotional coloring of the field. And just as Freud described how unconscious wishes in an individual's dream have been deconstructed, so these inner objects of the analysand and analyst are subsequently broken apart and then reassembled as the images populating the dream, the reverie, or the joke. These oniric images are composite figures assembled from aspects of each member of the analytic pair that have been quarried from various levels of their individual emotional lives, resulting in an infinite number of potential chimeras to represent the shared unconscious fantasy. An apt metaphor for this process is the creation of a mosaic from small chips of glass, stone, tile, or other materials that are carefully placed to assemble a picture. I will now turn to discuss how the unbidden appearance of a joke, a reverie, and a countertransference dream occurred to me at various points in the analytic work with a patient, and how these spontaneous unconscious constructions serve to represent the emotional climate of the hours. These manifestations prompted self-analytic work that enabled me to grab hold of sadistic themes that hovered at the edge of our respective awareness, yet which both the patient and I also address how a working through process was evident first in the emergence of a joke, then a reverie, and finally a countertransference dream. So, clinical material, Mr. 72. R, a man in his mid-60s, has lived alone his entire life, although he has many relationships with women, some lasting several years. He has enjoyed significant success in his career that has enabled him to fashion which he needs very little from others. His lively sense of imagination and capacity for irony is very engaging and he is proud of a particular aesthetic characterized by simplicity. He appears to wear the same casual clothes every day, though in reality has a large number of identical slacks, shirts, and shoes. The interior of his home is nearly monochromatic, with some splashes of color, and he has a picturesque summer residence that is quiet and bucolic. In his analysis, we have understood his need for sameness as offering a buffer zone against various impingements from sounds that are too loud, colors too bright, an unpredictably rageful father, a painful experience with the woman who dropped him, and latency age friends who would unsuspectedly attack him physically. I commented that his name could be Mr. 72 Degrees, which he subsequently adopted for himself, since he committed much of his life to maintaining an unwavering physical and emotional climate. Not long into R's analysis, he was buffeted by numerous losses of important family members, which broadsided him with unexpected waves of sadness. However, what unnerved him most was the stormy relationship and his intense rage with M, a beautiful woman much younger than he, who embodied what he called aesthetic perfection. In one session, R expressed angry toward M, and I commented that he seemed anxious about his anger invading the quietly peaceful time with her, and that it was also difficult to bring his rage into the sessions, which he preferred to keep tranquil. He went on to talk about the order of things getting disrupted, his fears of overreacting, and that he feels overwhelmed. Quote, that it's a less than easy way to be. I said that the phrase, a less than easy way to be, took the fire out of his rage, which he acknowledged as his typical defense of smoothing things out. At this point in the session, the following joke spontaneously came to my mind. It's the mid-1930s in Berlin, and two Jewish men, fearing that Hitler was going to be very bad for the Jews, hatched a plot. They followed his routine travels around the city and discovered that every Tuesday morning at 11 a.m., he passed a certain corner. They got a gun and waited for him to appear. They wait 15 minutes, no Hitler. Then a half hour, and still he doesn't appear. Finally, after an hour, one man turns to the other and says, "Gee, I hope he's okay." Unfortunately, I can't hear the chuckling in response. So I want to break here and tell a short story here. I have a good friend in LA who's an analyst, Annie Reiner, whose father was Carl Reiner, who recently died. And a few years ago, she and I were out to dinner in Los Angeles. And I had just heard this joke, and so I shared it with her. And she said, "Oh, that's a good joke." And then she said, "Hey, how about after we finish, let's go over to my father's house, Carl's house, and hang out for a while." So we did that. And after a short while, who should show up but Mel Brooks? So I'm there with Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner and my friend Annie. And my friend Annie says to me, "Larry, why don't you tell Mel that joke you told me at dinner?" And these guys are gods. I couldn't pretend to tell them a joke. And then Mel Brooks said, "Larry, come on, tell me that joke." So nervously, I told this joke to Mel Brooks. I didn't screw it up too badly. And he said to me, he said, in a very serious way, "That's a very complex joke." And I think being the comedian and the man that he is, I think he accurately picked up that there was an incredibly complex meaning that this joke had. And now I want to talk about the meaning I give it in this paper. So I assumed that this was a product, the joke, of my unconscious joke work, giving representation to emotions in the intersubjective field, and that the appearance of the character, Hitler, pointed to powerfully destructive affects permeating that field. In addition, to paraphrase Ogden, whose joke was this? I thought of the joke as a tragic comic story arising in my mind, but sponsored by linked unconscious processes operating out of the awareness of R and me. Furthermore, given Freud's observation that joke work, like dream work, is partly created through the mechanism of condensation, I immediately detected multiple themes active in the hour and also tied to our respective histories that were tightly compacted in this joke. On one level, the two Jewish men out to assassinate Hitler and were R and me, with Hitler representing my patience and, I believe, my feared destructiveness. The humor disguises the terrible reality of the Holocaust, which, despite the manic feeling of being able to prevent it in the joke, nevertheless wrought its annihilating slaughter. Was I representing the feeling that R and I were equally incapable of managing powerful hostile emotions should they arise in our relationship? Unknowns to R, he and I were born in the same part of New York City, the Bronx, several years after World War II. And though neither of our families had been directly touched by the Holocaust, knowledge of its horrors permeated the emotional atmosphere of our early childhoods. For example, my mother, who was an identical twin, talked about Mengele's inhuman twin experiments, which brought the barbarism of Auschwitz too close to home. From the angle of ours inner object world, we could see how his internal persecutors, his father, childhood bullies, were also folded into the Hitler figure. Thus, from a Freudian perspective, this joke expressed a shared wish that we could avert sadistic aggression from entering the analysis. From a Bionian vertex, the joke represented the immediate unconscious anxiety of the session, our shared fear that cruel aggression might spiral out of control. I had the sense that this joke contained a preliminary sort of interpretation, and I noticed that the joke came to mind immediately after R diminished feeling overwhelmed when he said, "It's a less than easy way to be." It felt important to me to offer some statement about what I thought was going on in the moment, though I was unable to extract something cogent from the joke to say, and thus I decided to let the joke speak for itself. I said to R that when he stated it's a less than easy way to be, a joke came to mind which I think had something important to say about what was happening in the session at the moment. I then told him the joke, and he said it reminded him of the story of the golem, a Frankenstein-like figure created out of earth, who came to save the lives of the Jews of Prague from ruin. I said that the golem prevented a catastrophe, and R continued by talking about his pleasure in creating something good that made him feel things were under his control. I interpreted, putting together what you were telling me about the golem, saving everything from ruin, and the joke about trying to kill Hitler. I think there's something about preventing a devastating catastrophe that we're talking about. And he replied, I have a fear that equilibrium, that existence could be knocked over. There's a scared little boy in there. He exists within me. When I'm in my element, everything's okay. but often am not. I set a bar of 72-degree room to keep from feeling vulnerable. But maybe it's too high and I'm making myself even more vulnerable because of that. Now, if we pay close attention to Freud's view of how jokes are unconsciously constructed, we can place their spontaneous appearance in the analyst's or patient's mind on equal footing with the importance accorded to dreams and like reveries, jokes that appear unbidden as, as a wild thought in the analytic hour are instigated by a preconscious thought that plunges into the unconscious and is associated with powerful affective experiences that magnetically draw associated memories and internal objects together, molding these into the reverie or dream, which then appears in conscious thinking as visual or auditory reverie or as a spontaneous joke already fully clothed in words. Both may express a wish and offer a commentary on what is happening in the unconscious field of the moment. I want to underline once more that we cannot overemphasize the essential role that condensation plays in the formation of a reverie, joke, or dream, and reflects the incredible capacity of the mind in barely a moment to fashion a multi-layered composite that symbolically registers unconscious and or unrepresented affects. Now I want to talk about uh, um, in Mr. R's analysis, how a reverie of mind and a conscious and a countertransference dream of mind were part furthering the development, the clinical development. So I want to present now material from R's analysis several weeks after the quote joke session to illustrate the use of reverie and dream as pathways to representing the analyst's unconscious experience in the analytic hour. In the Thursday session, the last of 4 sessions of the week, I returned a minute late from an appointment out of my office to be greeted by R in my waiting room, who somewhat sarcastically said, "Welcome home, you're cutting it close." On the couch, he spoke about an angry argument with M and that she was not returning his calls. I commented that perhaps it feels that M and I are cutting it too close, leaving him in an uncertain situation. He went on to speak about things being out of his control, which inevitably brought up memories of the childhood friends who unexpectedly bullied him. I said that he needs to feel in control of situations in order to avoid being thrown into an unsafe and unprotected place, to which R began to speak about feeling trapped doing things he does not want to do and having feelings he does not want to have. He continued, "I don't like being that angry. I end up feeling, not feeling like a player anymore." I think Freud's observation that the joke is initiated by a preconscious thought, pushed into the unconscious, and then resurfaces as a joke applies to the formation of a reverie. When R spoke of not feeling like a player, the word player triggered the following reverie for me. A scene from the film The Pope of Greenwich Village, in which 3 small-time hoodlums, one of whom is an older man, probably in his 60s, steal money from a mafia boss and are found out. One of the younger men has his thumb cut off, and the older thief, realizing that he would be killed, moves out of town in haste, leaving behind his wife and child. The central part of my reverie is the look of having been beaten down in the old man's face, which evokes in me a sense of humiliation. I was distracted by my evocative reverie and then, quote, rejoined R as he was saying that he would like a t-shirt with "Just Leave Me Alone" printed on it. He continued by expressing a wish for a fortress of solitude, Superman's private place for rest and reflection, and, quote, that I have no breathing room, no place to go. It would be an important place to go for my survival. I replied, I think being here feels like a place of solitude, and that my being a minute or two late today seems to have punctured that, threatened your survival. As the hour drew to a close, I felt that my interventions had emphasized R's need for safety to the exclusion of sadistic themes of being beaten down, castrated, thumbs being cut off, and survival threatened. Over the weekend, I had the following dream. He and I are in a bathroom, and he is on his knees washing out the tub, cleaning it. I noticed that he has stacked some items, perhaps on a sink nearby, that look like they could be from my desk. I have a feeling of being gone into my bathroom, moved my things, and placed them somewhere they don't belong, and that he is cleaning my tub. The dream brought to mind that even though R is respectful of my boundaries, never asks where I go or any other possible questions, that he enters the office like he owns the place. He puts his keys and cell phone on my desk and drapes his jacket on the desk chair in a friendly manner while asking me how I am, so that I have not been aware really of feeling intruded on until this dream. Nevertheless, the dream evokes emotions of being controlled by and encroached on through his apparent kindness, like his scrubbing the tub as though it belonged to him. There is also something pathetic and devalued about the dream image of him on his knees cleaning the bathtub, and this brings to mind the defeated and humiliated older man from my reverie in the last session. Finally, the phrase, like he owns the place, is an idiom my mother used, and together with the image of scrubbing the tub, it brings her intrusiveness to mind. I view the countertransference dream as revealing the deep unconscious way the patient is being dreamed into existence in the analyst's mind. This is an unconscious mental activity by which the analysand gradually comes alive emotionally for the analyst through the linkage of aspects of the patient with analogous sectors in the analyst's mind. In addition, affects that arise within a session that exceed the capacity of the analyst and patient to represent in the hour may serve as preconscious day residues that stimulate the countertransference dream. In the session in which my Pope of Greenwich Village reverie occurred, R began with a sarcastic comment when I was late for a minute and went on to speak about his fear of losing control of anger, feeling bullied, and needing to be in charge of situations. I interpreted that being in control was a means of feeling safe, and he replied that when he is not in charge, he no longer feels like a player, which triggered my reverie associated emotions of being beaten down and humiliated. Thus, my reverie picked up on and represented R's fear that survival was at stake and his need for safety. However, by emphasizing the need for protection, I unconsciously sidestepped the aggression in the hour, manifesting things like cutting thumbs off, cutting things too closely, etc. I believe that the theme of sadistic control was not directly addressed in the session, sponsored my countertransference dreams 3 days later, which depicted these emotions on several levels. My initial feeling in the dream was that R was being helpful in cleaning my tub. That's what I felt during the dream. But this quickly changed to feeling invaded by him, which brought to mind his controlling behavior in the sessions, masked by chatty friendliness and acting like he owned the place. In addition, casting R as cleaning the tub on his knees made me aware of my sadistic wish to control, diminish, and humiliate him, which reminded me of the beaten down older thief in my reverie, a representation that condensed my empathy for R with a sadistic wish to dominate him. Furthermore, the connection to memories of my mother amplified the theme of invasiveness and control and added another layer of meaning that transformed the shared emotional field into one colored by sadism, dominance, and humiliation. Thus, my countertransference dream appeared to give representation to a conflict active at the analysis. Two men in their 60s engaged in unconscious struggle for dominance hidden by friendly feelings and apparent helpfulness, and both struggling to stay oblivious to these emotions. So now discussion. In this paper, I focused on three pathways by which the analyst represents his unconscious experience in the immediacy of the clinical hour: reverie, joke work, and the countertransference dream. Informational processes have in common and important ways in which they differ. All three are formed by a similar process, an emotional experience that must be represented for unconscious communication to occur through the evocation of analogous affects in the receiver. However, there are also differences between these psychic events. Reveries and jokes are formed in the here and now of the analytic hour, while countertransference dreams are constructed perhaps days after the initiating emotional stimulus. Put another way, the reverie and joke are more experienced near to the instigating emotional event and are more clearly tied to the affects alive during the session in the intersubjective field. On the one hand, since there are many interceding events occurring between the clinical hour and the subsequent countertransference dream, like 3 days between in this instance, it is much more difficult to trace the dream images back to the original emotional residue of the session. However, on the other hand, the countertransference dream offers us insight into how these affects have been transformed by dream work and folded into the dreamer's unconscious associative networks. Consequently, we see how my countertransference dream gave vivid representation to the sadistic feelings that were embedded in my joke and in my reverie, but were defended against in the here and now of the sessions and avoided in my previous interpretations. I would like to offer some comments about interpretation. As Bion has taught us, an interpretation is the analyst's transformation of the affects active in the here and now of the session. How does the clinician use such data in formulating an interpretation, that is, developing an hypothesis about what is occurring in the moment? It is here that I believe the joke differs from the reverie and the countertransference dream. We will recall that Freud stated the joke emerges from the unconscious as a rule already clothed in words, which immediately distinguishes from reverie that are primarily visual and/or auditory in nature. The joke is a more organized structure that has already been encoded verbally at the time of its appearance in consciousness, having condensed various levels of meaning through the process of joke work. Thus, in many instances, such as my joke about Hitler, the joke is a sophisticated interpretation that may yield an image of the momentary emotional field, thereby evoking further associations in the analyst and the patient. However, due to the fact that the joke has been created unconsciously and comprises many condensed levels of meaning, the analyst may remain unaware of what he is fully communicating to the patient, as in the joke that my analyst told me. Thus, if we decide to relate a joke to a patient, the analyst may be offering an inadvertent interpretation. Similarly, David Lieberman, who's an Argentine psychoanalyst, would occasionally tell a joke to a patient which he considered an interpretive action. In contrast, the reverie and countertransference dream also offer potential insights into the therapeutic relationship, but these require the analyst to first ferret out meanings that are less clear and have yet to be registered verbally. Thus, the Pope of Greenwich Village reverie was at first enigmatic until I was moved by feelings of humiliation and beaten down, as well as the need for safety that the reverie induced in me. I was swayed by these anxieties to ignore the implicit sadistic trends in the joke as well as in the reverie. However, away from the pressure of the session in which the sadistic themes were mutually defended against by R and me, the countertransference dream absorbed and gave expression to the affects too threatening for this analytic pair to face in the hour. In this manner, the three pathways to representing the analyst's unconscious experience of the hour worked in tandem. Each provided a unique vertex by which the patient and the relationship between the analyst and the analysand come to light in the analyst's mind. What I have been describing is how reverie, joke work, and countertransference dreams have a role in working through. Although Freud's focus in working through was on the repetition of the repressed past as encrypted in the transfer, he also stated that the analysand acts out his neurosis, quote, not as an event of the past, but as a present-day force, close quote. When Bion gave his first lecture in Los Angeles, 1967, recommending that the analyst forego memory and desire, he introduced his talk by saying he really had nothing new to say. In another publication, I commented that, quote, what is most evident to me in Notes on Memory and Desire is Bion's unequivocal emphasis on the here and now of the session that is implicit in Freud's notion of the transference neurosis as a present-day force, which Bion brings into bold relief as the centerpiece of his technical recommendations, that is, being without memory and desire. In addition, just as Freud recommended that the analyst, quote, give himself over completely to his unconscious memory, so Bion urged the analyst to be patiently receptive to, quote, some idea or pictorial impression which floats through the mind unbidden as a whole. Thus, the spontaneous unconscious constructions of reverie, joke work, and countertransference dreams are the equivalent of Freud's present-day force that represent the emotions alive in the moment of the session. However, unlike Freud's view that these are crafted from repressed memories, these constructions are highly condensed creations assembled from facets of internal objects in both the analyst and analysand, adhered together by the unconscious affects permeating the intersubjective field. Brenman Pick has written about working through in the countertransference, by which she means how the analyst manages the inevitable disturbing effect of the patient's projective identifications. She importantly asserts that the clinician must internally work through the evoked emotional disruption, which she calls, quote, catch the illness of the patient, in order to be able to give the analysand a, quote, truly deep versus superficial interpretation. Her focus remains on the analyst achieving a clarity between what the patient projects and the analyst's reaction to the projection in order to enhance interpretive accuracy. With regard to the contemporary analytic field theory, Farrow broadens Brenman's analyst catching the illness of the patient and comments that the intersubjective field itself may fall ill, contaminated by the shared illness of the analytic couple. However, for Farrow, the cure for this malady is the restoration of a capacity for dreaming in a Bionian sense in order to resume transformation of emotional experience that has been arrested by the illness of the field. In this regard, once transformative dreaming returns, the analytic couple recover their fertility and spontaneous unconscious constructions reappear as if out of hibernation. What then is the role that reverie, joke work, and countertransference dreams play in working through? As Ogden has said, patients come to us for help with dreaming their psychotic dreams that are too painful to dream, what he calls night terrors, or their interrupted non-psychotic dreams, that's ordinary nightmares. In assisting the analysand to dream split off or inaccessible experience, the analyst is helping the patient symbolize, quote, and it is through this process of building up symbols in the dream work that part of the process of working through takes place. This is from De Rojo Barros in Sao Paulo, if you know his work. Very good. The process of transformation from a raw emotional symbol, from a raw emotion into a symbol, with beyond terms an emotional thought, is a beginning stage in working through, since one cannot work through anything unless it is first represented. Unrepresented experience is evacuated from the psyche by acting out or as psychosomatic difficulties, drug addiction, etc. The analyst's capacity to transform affective experience through his reverie, joke work, or countertransference dreams is therefore a vital step which leads to the capacity for working through. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry, for a very interesting paper. I would like to spend a lot more time asking you about your dinner with Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner. I think all of us would, but we'll have to get that at another time. In the interest of time, we will adjust our lunch break following our next presenter. So our third presenter for today is Barbara D'Amato. Barbara will be responding to Giuseppe's paper and adding her own thoughts on dreaming. Barbara D'Amato is on the faculties of the Center for Modern Psychoanalytic Studies and the New York Graduate School of Psychoanalysis. She is the director of the CMPS Distance Learning Program. She has had an interest in dreams and dreaming for many years and has written extensively on literary authors and their dreams. She's also written on the function of aggression in dreams and the modern psychoanalytic approach to working with dreams. She has presented internationally on dream topics and research. Her forthcoming paper, A Waking Dream, Condensation and Symbolism in Bob Dylan's Murder Most Foul, addresses the Bionian topic of continuous dream states, as well as Freud's most important dream formulations. Barbara, are you there?
I'm here.
The time is yours.
Hello, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be here in such good company with the presenters this morning. Before I start my paper, I just have to say something about the here and now. The most exciting thing about speaking at a conference for me is to be able to see the audience and to see how they're reacting to you. And because we're on Zoom, obviously, we don't have any of that. So I had some idea about how to get around that. Do you know how they've been putting these cutout figures in the stadiums, the football stadiums and the baseball stadiums. I don't know if that is to make the players feel like they're not alone or their sponsors to feel like they can sell things. But I thought that'd be a really good idea to fill my office with a bunch of cutout figures and paste faces on of people who I know and love. And then for people who I don't know, maybe, draw some smiley faces. I don't know. I could also consider it a long table with a white linen tablecloth and some chrysanthemums, but okay, let's get started. Sharon Robinson collaborated, sang backup, and co-wrote many songs with the legendary Leonard Cohen. In 2015, a year before his death, she released her second solo CD, and I quote from her song, Along for the Ride. Whose soul did we sell for this thing that we bought? Whose mind did we lose for this freedom of thought? Whose heart did we break for this peace in the dark? Whose days did we trade for this stroll in the park? I'm going to repeat those 4 lines simply because Micheál O'Sullivan, a young Irish poet who I met once in New York City and then again in Ireland several times, always recites his poems twice. When I saw and heard him do this the first time, it seemed obvious why. The words that create a poem are few, yet they paint a rich landscape of color, shape, and texture. They are permeated with feeling. Poetry is concise, yet fleeting. Each word is carefully chosen. I never asked Micheál why he repeated his poems twice. I wish I had. Actually, since this writing, I had an opportunity to ask Micheál, but that's another conference, another paper, maybe another story. Whose soul did we sell for this thing that we bought? Whose mind did we lose for this freedom of thought? Whose heart did we break for this peace in the dark? Whose days did we trade for this stroll in the park? These lyrics are at once dreamlike and a dream. They draw the listener in. What they mean depends on who you are and how you hear them. They connect to something deeply unconscious, intensely emotional, and inexplicably compelling within me. So, we dream while we are asleep as unconscious id impulses press for discharge, but are held in check by a strong ego sensor that allows us to remain ignorant of the dream's true sexual or aggressive meaning. Sigmund Freud. We dream while we are awake, or perhaps all of the time, so we can process beta elements, raw sensory and unmentalized feelings and sensations, into usable alpha elements that permit us to think. Via a mechanism called alpha function, the process that digests the emotions, or our mother's first ministrations, Wilfred Bion. We dream while we are with our patients during analytic sessions and share experiences that are co-created through our unconscious connection. We dream in the cinema as we merge with images and feeling states in the dark. Put very simply, of course, Giuseppe Civitarese. We dream when we tell a joke, produce a countertransference stream that arises from the sensations and communications of a patient, and in the simple act of reverie during any or every analytic hour. We dream when we are trying to understand the symbolic transference communications of a patient's dream report and the ordinary content of an analytic hour, Spotnitz and Meadow. That's a lot of dreaming. I'd like to share with you a few instances of when I've had the pleasure to dream. But before I do that, I want to acknowledge my memories and dream encounters with our 2 distinguished conference presenters this morning. Perhaps in the fall of 2019, maybe it was the winter of 2020, in real life, pre-COVID, Dr. Civitarese led a discussion sponsored by Adrienne Harris in New York City. It was a live supervision. The analyst presented the case of a teenage boy who knew that he was the result of in vitro fertilization. Now, if that's not fodder for dreaming, I don't know what is. Or be careful how much you tell your children. The group listened as the engaging supervisee presented. Then we asked questions as our associations arose in response to the narrative we heard and the impact it had upon each listener. Dr. Civitarese deftly facilitated the discussion. I had this sense that he felt the case, the presenter, and the material. He seemed to me a vast storehouse of theoretical knowledge and ideas about the associations to the case, material as well as the case itself. As we bore witness to earlier this morning, it appears to me he is not bound by theoretical parameters, but that they free him. He allows himself to dream. It's a special kind of attunement. His paper today explained in accessible language that dreaming is many things and takes many forms. Specifically in the analytic session, a dream that occurs between analyst and analysand is a joint venture, a partnership. When these dreams occur, or at least when we can identify them, we come into contact with what Dr. Chivitorise calls the O of the session. Dr. Chivitorise's ideas resonate deeply with the modern psychoanalytic idea of the dream as a transference communication that arises from the analyst's reverie and in response to all aspects of the patient. Whenever I hear a patient's dream, whether a formal nocturnal dream report or the content of a session, I am listening for the transference, which is frequently communicated symbolically. What is the patient telling me about us? When I experience a waking dream in the session, I understand it as something the patient is unconsciously communicating to me about herself and about us. Sometimes it's within the patient's conscious awareness. Many times the patient does not yet know. Modern analysts are very patient, or at least I am. I often hold information that I understand about a patient silently in check until the time and the emotional temperature are right. If I do not have the correct feeling, I usually do not say what I might be thinking. If, however, I'm flooded with feeling, I have to find some way to use it therapeutically. My intervention might be highly emotionally charged, especially if my reaction is a repetitive feeling to a repetitive content that has finally come to an emotional crescendo in the room. At other times, my response could be neutral or simply reflective of what the patient has said. It depends on the patient. I have absolute trust in the signals my body sends out when my container is full. Analysts need to protect themselves from toxic levels of feeling. This is not wild analysis, but quite the opposite. It's contingent upon each patient, each specific patient, and the sensations they arouse in me over the course of treatment. There's no time frame, no itinerary, no reservations to be made. These waking dream moments happen when they happen. Probably 7 or 8 years ago, Dr. Larry Brown spoke to the faculty at CMPS. Invited by our own Sarah Sheftel, his topic was Wilfred Bion. We read a few of Bion's papers he had sent in preparation for the event. In that group, I shared the following vignette from a patient, which felt like a very important waking dream. Some of you might have been there and you may remember this. The patient's sister, his dead sister, had haunted him for much of his life. Her name is tattooed on his back, and he referred to himself in treatment as a walking cemetery. The young sister died when she was 4 and my patient was 2. At the age of 24 and in graduate school on the West Coast, the patient was visiting his family's East Coast home for the weekend. He reported he had discovered a dead fawn in the front yard when he arrived to his parents' home that evening. His father said to him, "We can deal with it in the morning in the daylight." The next morning, my patient reported he covered his upper and lower torso with large trash bags, then lifted and carried the dead animal to a deep ravine behind the property, where he lowered it to its final resting place. He relayed this story to me in a phone session, and he reported it without affect. As he spoke, and as I imagined him slowly proceeding through the woods behind his home, carrying the dead animal as if in a funeral procession, I was filled with such sorrow that tears began to stream down my face. I asked him why I felt so sad hearing this story, and he characteristically replied, "Probably because I'm having some feeling I don't want to have." It had something to do with Bion's paper, which paper I cannot now recall, and it probably doesn't even matter. but that retelling has remained with me, internally brandished in my relationship with this particular patient. At a pre-Oedipal age, prior to the acquisition of language, the patient had never verbally or emotionally processed the death of his sister. His ceremonious carrying of a lone baby deer to its woodland grave in the ravine behind and below his family's home seemed like he was transporting himself, at least emotionally, closer to a split-off feeling. He was burying his sister. He didn't know it. In reporting this story, he did want me to know that his treatment was carrying him forward toward life as he buried a deadened part of himself. I mean, clearly I was flooded with the feeling and he was not even in touch with it. Each of today's presenters has described this dream experience. Dr. Chivitarise says, I see reverie or an action or a bodily sensation as belonging to the analytic field, never just my own or the patient's. Larry Brown, in describing 3 modes of representation this morning, said, spontaneous unconscious constructions are each by a similar process. Put briefly, each is created by a pre-conscious thought that initiates an unconscious process from which the dream, joke, reverie, etc. emerges unbidden in the analyst's mind. The power of these moments is always striking, as if planets have aligned in an ephemeral yet perfectly balanced constellation, permitting emotional communications of this sort to occur. The closest visual image that comes to my mind is Michelangelo's creation of Adam on the Sistine ceiling. 2 index fingers are stretched towards each other. An infinitesimal space between them vibrates with desire. What happens beyond that moment of immeasurable tension as they approach can only be life. This is my definition of a waking dream. It is neither contrived nor a premeditated idea that we set about to dream together. To pretend to have jurisdiction over this process is to err. When the timing is right, it just happens. Some patients will dream with us, while many will not. Some analysans create dreams with us frequently, some hardly at all, until one day, out of nowhere, a rare dream experience occurs. It is then that we robustly fuse with the patient in a way that seems fresh. We feel the patient and understand them for perhaps the very first time. This, it seems to me, is a waking dream, a shared unconscious yet richly emotional moment. It's not critical, as this has been said this morning a few times, it is not critical for the patient to verbalize or consciously acknowledge the meaning of the dream because it is apprehended in their unconscious. Putting it into words may be for another day. Back in October, Richard Sachs, our esteemed conference chair, invited me to speak at this conference and told me that Larry Brown would read a paper from his most recent publication, Transformational Processes in Clinical Psychoanalysis, and that he had selected Chapter 8 for today's conference presentation. I told Richard I would purchase the book. Fiddling around on the Rutledge website, I saw the volume and realized that I already own it and that I had used a chapter in my dreams class at CMPS the previous semester. I pulled the volume off my shelf, flipped to Chapter 8, and of course I had already marked it up quite a bit, underlined extensively, jotted notes, defined words in the margin, etc. Chapter 8, which is the chapter we heard this morning, was the chapter I had put on my dreams class syllabus the previous spring. That to me had something to do with dreaming. It was an unexplainable connection with no conscious reference or memory. Something that was beyond my grasp, yet oddly within my unconscious capacities. Perhaps a cosmic experience, if we can for a moment think of the unconscious as a cosmic force field connecting us all, that I had no awareness of until I did. Larry Brown, it seems that I dream about you. I'm not sure this qualifies me for a Waking Dream Award. Perhaps we would both have to participate, or perhaps it was my waking dream with your new book or today's presentation. Some of my work with dreams. After her first session back, following my 5-week August hiatus, a patient reported to me what felt like a waking dream. I'm quoting the patient now. We went on a short trip to the Poconos. My husband found an Airbnb and we had a really nice time. We came upon a small cemetery while hiking. Sidebar, this patient is very, very fond of cemeteries, as am I. Back to the patient's report. We lingered there in the cemetery for a bit. My son was taking photographs of headstones and texting, while my husband was admiring a small stream in the quietness of the beautiful forest. I was a little ahead of them and lost in thought. The family decided to swing back to the car, but I wanted to remain there for a bit longer. It was very peaceful, I remember. And then I heard a voice, or maybe I just thought it, but it was a distinct voice in my head, and it said to me, "Don't leave me." I don't know what that meant, or even if I was going crazy, the patient said. Were the souls in the cemetery trying to communicate with me? I did not tell the patient what I thought her dream meant, but I was fairly certain it was a transference communication dream. She did not understand it herself. She felt something was pushing for discharge, but had no cognizance of what the feeling was or why she was feeling it at that moment near the gravestones. The fact that she told me in her session would suggest it was about her relationship with me and how she had experienced our first lengthy break. She was becoming attached. We had had about 9 months of treatment prior to the August interruption, and then I left her, perhaps for dead, in a cemetery. A supervisee presents an angry patient whose mother oscillated between brutality and neglect. The patient's father was emotionally unavailable. The patient reports being beaten, left alone, and unsupervised for much of his early life. In adolescence, he developed asthma and heart condition. Needless to say, this patient repeats what he probably internalized as life with a dangerous mother. He courts danger, gets involved with people who give him no support, and always feels misunderstood while he blindly provokes rage in others. In the transference, my supervisee is his dangerous mother. Luckily, my supervisee often feels like killing him. She has a keen understanding of the patient, and she uses her aggression therapeutically with him when he goads her with his words. Recently, he's become aware of his need to induce people to murder him, or at minimum, place him in harm's way. He's made progress. This supervisee knows that he needs to be with a mother who may have murderous feelings, but who at the same time continues to keep him alive. The patient has taken many risks during the pandemic, and he puts himself in jeopardy with strangers, with old acquaintances, and a currently unstable love interest. When the patient wished to return to in-person sessions, the supervisee was put into conflict because she was permitting a few patients who are as fastidious as she is around masking and distancing to return to her office. Should she allow him to resume live sessions? He appeared to need to be able to see her again. No, he absolutely should not return to in-person sessions, I blurted out. The potential for danger, always present with this patient, sizzled like a spark. The patient was pulling my supervisee into the repetitive loop of destruction with he and his mother. The three of us, patient, analyst, and supervisor, were connected in that one instance. It was a powerful moment. Life and death moments usually are. Perhaps, if you allow me, Dr. Shivatrudise, I would call this the O of the supervision. A Waking Dream, Condensation, and Bob Dylan. Shortly after coronavirus quarantine began in the United States, 1 year ago in March of 2020, Bob Dylan released a 17-minute song. It was his first original recording in almost 8 years. Bob Dylan was in his 78th year. As a lifelong diehard fan, I scrolled through my YouTube app after learning Dylan had a new single. Headphones in place, I listened with wondrous anticipation. Murder Most Foul is the title, and that alone set a certain context for what would come. The title, taken from Hamlet, sows a seed that prepares the listener. Prepares the listener how, you might ask? I cannot really say, but it sets a feeling tone, an expectation, a sense of longing, or perhaps a seeking for something imagined in the heart and mind of the listener. The images and associations from the title are as endless as the associations to any dream. In a rare public reflection on his process, Bob Dylan, in a New York Times interview with Douglas Brinkley in 2020, described how he wrote the song. I quote, It's the kind of thing where you pile up stream of consciousness verses and then leave it alone and come and pull things out. Obviously, the catalyst for the song is the title line. It's one of those things where you write it on instinct, end quote. What good fortune did I have that Dylan gave an interview as I was writing about him. As my meditation app sometimes readies me for sleep, this title prepared me for Dylan's song. His voice was stronger than I remembered, and I would come to learn that Murder Most Foul had been recorded quite a few years earlier than 2020. Bob Dylan begins. Now, I am going to spare you my Bob Dylan imitation. I'm just going to read the beginning words of the song. It was a dark day in Dallas, November 63, a day that would live on in infamy. President Kennedy was a riding high. Good day to be living and a good day to die. Well, the opening lines are pretty straightforward. Dylan croons his way through the graphic narrative of the JFK assassination, which was without question a murder most foul. Although the Kennedy case was closed following government investigations and a lone assassin was charged, most Americans understand the decades-old presidential murder is a cold case. We don't really know who killed JFK or why. That part of the song is clear, but much of the rest of the song makes very little sense when listened to the first time around. But Dylan, like so many songwriters, is like that. Songs, like poems and dreams, are frequently about something other than what the manifest words suggest. Early songs, now bear with me if you're not a Bob Dylan fan, if there's such a thing. I would ask for a show of hands, but on Zoom, I would get the answer that I want. Early songs like Subterranean Homesick Blues, Hard Rains Are Gonna Fall, Desolation Row, Bob Dylan's 115th Dream are all commentaries on the state of the world and humanity's place in it. His lyrics are frequently political, while they speak to the greed and manipulation of those in power. Sometimes irreverent, they can also be witty and even absurd. Dylan was a protest folk singer of the 60s, crying out against war, poverty, and injustice. Later, Dylan would convert to Christianity, and his lyrics would overflow with references to Jesus Christ. In that vein, Murder Most Foul was no exception. So what was Murder Most Foul about? I had no working hypothesis yet, but I was drawn to the song and I listened to it every night after finishing work with patients in quarantine in my home office. I played it every single night for months. It was like a drug. It was intoxicating, yet it was pleasurable and mysterious. It was decidedly dark, like the times we were living in. Everything was closed. I was only practicing out of my Brooklyn home office, where I am now, a borough away from my Union Square office, and working on the telephone. Going to the supermarket had become a dangerous undertaking. I was wearing a mask, sanitizing my hands, as you all were, and everything I brought into my home. I hadn't seen my daughters for more than 3 months. What was this song giving me? What did it mean? After a few months of listening to it, I knew I had to write about Murder Most Foul. I'm only going to share a few brief examples from that full paper, which is entitled A Waking Dream, Condensation and Symbolism in Bob Dylan's Murder Most Foul. When I was working on my doctoral dissertation on the psychic loss in the dreams of adopted women, I conducted a pilot study in which I defined every word in a number of dreams using Webster's dictionary. I was amazed to learn that many words also mean their opposite. Given the early Greek or Roman origins, which the dictionary apps no longer provide, but a tattered hard copy of Webster's New World Dictionary 1960 surely did. For example, the word go, G-O, is defined to leave behind, to abolish, but it is also defined to move toward a person or a place. The word go can mean to depart from or to approach. The word behind is defined in the rear, in the past, but it is further defined at an earlier time or yet to come. For example, there is good news behind. Hence, behind can mean something that is past or something yet to come. The dictionary is a remarkable research tool. Driven or compulsively in that vein, I began to Google search phrases in the song Dylan's song that seemed out of place. I was captivated by what I found, and I quote again from Murder Most Foul. It happened so quickly, so quick by surprise, right there in front of everyone's eyes. Greatest magic trick ever under the sun, perfectly executed, skillfully done. Wolfman, oh wolfman, howl. Rub-a-dub-dub, it's a murder most foul. Well, some of it makes sense. The shooting of JFK right there in front of everyone's eyes seemed like an unprejudiced accounting of what happened. Wolfman might be a reference to Wolfman Jack, the famous, some might say, revolutionary disc jockey who shares his first name with the song's central figure. Wolfman Jack was, of course, a spinner of tunes and at the height of his radio career in the 1960s. Much of the later lyrics in Murder Most Foul could be Dylan's homage to musicians who influenced and predated him, as the verses abound with references to song titles and songwriters. Wolfman, oh wolfman, howl may also be a reference to Allen Ginsberg's famous poem, Howl, which bellows in a visceral tone of mourning and channels Shakespeare's King Lear. Ginsberg's poem echoes death, repression, and the subjugation of a generation. Along with many other literary authors, Dylan has frequently cited the Beat poets throughout his oeuvre. So far, the lines constructed a rational, albeit emotional narrative. But rub-a-dub-dub, that phrase was akin to a small pebble in my shoe. It bothered me because I did not know why it was there. My immediate association, and perhaps yours, to rub-a-dub-dub was the eponymous nursery rhyme. Like fairy tales and myths, there are infinite versions of nursery rhymes. This one selection from Chris Roberts' 2006 book on the meaning of nursery rhymes, called Heavy Words Lightly Thrown, dates back to the 14th century. It's just a few lines, I'm going to read it. Hey, rub-a-dub, ho, rub-a-dub, 3 maids in a tub. And who do you think were there? The butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, and all of them gone to the fair. British tabloids, according to Roberts, have always coveted stories about respectable people being caught in compromising situations. I mean, are there any tabloids and newspapers that don't? In this case, it's a fairground attraction with naked bathing ladies. The upper class or respectable tradesmen, candlestick maker, butcher, and baker, are ogling, getting an eyeful of some naked young women in a tub, perhaps at one of the fair's more dubious or risque sideshows. Dylan cleverly augments the song's ominous tone with the nonsense words rub-a-dub-dub. As the butcher, baker, and candlestick maker are enjoying a tawdry peeping Tom moment, the unsuspecting folks on the streets of Dallas witness another untoward scene as they watch Kennedy's head fly backward from the force of automatic gunfire. Dylan's musical canvas might be Freud's concept of condensation in all of its psychoanalytic glory. Dylan sings us through the events of the murder as the motorcade makes its way around Elm Street and onto the Triple Underpass. Then he shifts gear. But let's, for a moment, go back to my addictive listening to the song, my close of day ritual with Murder Most Foul. Was it Dylan's voice? Many would disagree, but I find it rhapsodic. Was it the lyrics? His rhyming is always executed with precision, while his meaning is mostly elusive. Something in the song was speaking to me. Dylan, as the voice of a generation of the 60s, and his anti-Vietnam War protest songs were a large part of his identity as a songwriter. That Murder Most Foul was released, one, during a global pandemic, in the wake of the Me Too movement, in which both men and women were speaking out in unprecedented numbers against sexual abuse by powerful men, and 3, the George Floyd's murder by 4 Minneapolis police officers was not coincidental. The Black Lives Matter movement was also sweeping through cities across the country and around the world. In 2020, the United States presidential campaigns were in full swing, and Americans were deeply divided about the direction the country should go. Polarization in America had bled into family dynamics. In some homes, political discourse had to be banned in order to avoid knockdown fights around the dinner table. I quote again from Dylan's lyrical verses, which read as dream images. Hush, little children, you'll understand. The Beatles are coming, they're gonna hold your hand. Slide down the banister and go get your coat. Ferry cross the Mersey and go for the throat. This song is about Dylan's life and his early days in the music scene. The Beatles were coming. Now, well, every reference here is around 1963. The Beatles were coming with rock and roll. Innocence, Dylan's departure from folk music, coming of age, life and death, all seem to be represented in the condensation of the JFK murder in the early 1960s. In his 8th decade, Dylan had to be reminiscing about his life. During a worldwide pandemic, we may all have been. Freud's idea that one simple dream image represents layer upon layer upon layer of meaning is beautifully depicted throughout Murder Most Foul. The song could be a banner or a clever marketing strategy announcing a hip new course on dream condensation. Bob Dylan is an infamous master of wordplay. He combines phrases filled with sparse words that on first glance may be incomprehensible, but upon reflection can hold profound meaning. For example, in the second part of the verse I just read, slide down the banister, go get your coat, ferry cross the Mersey and go for the throat. The verse standing alone is odd. If we sift the lines through a sieve and parse a few words at a time within the emotional tenor of the images and in the context of the song, meaning comes to bear. I'm almost near the end of the paper. I know you've been listening for a long time. 2 more pages. This is the same protocol we apply when attempting to interpret a dream, examining one image at a time and then noticing connections between and among them. A child sliding down a banister is a playful, sweet image, one of youthful bliss without a care in the world. Dylan seems to be painting a picture of innocence that abruptly ends or prematurely shatters with the dissolution of Camelot in the White House, in America, and perhaps in all of our lives. It was Jackie who coined the Kennedy years as one shining moment that was Camelot in an interview with Life magazine shortly after the assassination. Jackie wanted her husband to be remembered as a man of magic. She reminisced that Jack loved the Broadway musical Camelot and frequently played its theme song on a Victrola before they retired to bed. Ferry crossed the Mersey. Now, if I was a little bit older, maybe a lot older, I would have known this, but I had no idea that Ferry Crossed the Mersey was a song. It was written by Jerry Marsden, lead singer of Jerry and the Pacemakers. In 1964, Brian Epstein, who also managed the Beatles, represented this group through the Mersey Beat music period. In the late 50s and 60s, Liverpool was awash with young talent and electric guitars that defined the genre. The Mersey Beat scene was pressing towards decline, closely overlapping with the presidential assassination. This verse resonates with a moment in history. Dylan was keenly aware how the Mersey Beat explosion impacted the music world. He was a contemporary of that exciting climate, especially considering his own controversial transition from folk guitar to electrified music in 1965. The times they were a-changing. The ferry named in the song is an actual commuter boat that carries passengers across the Mersey River from Liverpool to points on the nearby English Wirral Peninsula. It's a waterway jaunt that transports riders from one English locale to another. It involves change, leaving one vantage point and arriving at a second through time and space. It's a brief journey, perhaps akin to that of a presidential motorcade cruising through Dallas that fateful afternoon. Hence, the simple phrase, ferry cross the Mersey, evokes layers of meaning. And go for the throat. These final 5 words of the verse summon an inauspicious image. Going for the throat implies silencing, choking, doing harm. Of course, the first shot that hit JFK either entered in the back of his neck and exited through his throat, or entered through his throat. Many of the technical details remain disputed. One line of lyric communicates volumes, and the two parts of the verse linked by a ferry boat teeter blissful innocence with tragic and violent death, perhaps a metaphor for the human condition. We are all on a pilgrimage traversing forks in the road and bends in the curve. Like the video footage of an officer's knee on George Floyd's neck, we witness injustice. And in those moments, we are confronted by the preciousness of life. In the previously mentioned New York Times interview with Dylan, Dylan said, and I quote, "I think about the death of the human race, the long, strange trip of the naked ape. Not to be light on it, but everybody's life is so transient. Every human being, no matter how strong or mighty, is frail when it comes to death. I think about this in general terms, not in a personal way," end quote. Well, even Bob Dylan has defenses. This might sound cliche, but were the times changing or were they starkly the same? Was Dylan unable to hold himself back from protesting? And why was I so captivated by this? Maybe there are no answers. Perhaps the dreams I had as I listened to Murder Most Foul were answer enough. Or perhaps the sections of the paper I just shared helped me to process my own experience. It's possible the song sustained me during the seismic shift that coronavirus pandemic inflicted upon my world. As I read this right now, a year after the fact, it is irrefutably clear that I needed to escape into this Dylan dream state. I have no doubt it was a shared dream. Night after night, my husband Ernie never disturbed me as I sat in the living room with ear pods in place and readied myself for my musical fix. He knew what it meant to me, even if I did not. While I was deep into my evening Dylan reverie, Ernie gave me this space. So I never had to profess to him or to anyone else, "Please, don't wake me up." Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. What a wonderful paper. It took me dreaming back to the 60s, to my own experiences of some of the events that you brought up. And thank you for taking us on a journey through music and literature. That's why I always enjoy your papers so much. I want to thank all the presenters